Hey, it's Mr. Bass. This is part 2 of the very best baits and lures I used, or the best techniques, you might say, to catch 803 fish in 2021. Now, this is part 2, which means there's a part 1. If you go back and watch part 1, you will see the 5 biggest baits that caught me the most fish. In fact, as I said on the previous video, those 5 baits caught me at least 50% of my fish in 2021, and probably more closely 75% of all of my fish in 2021. But I fished a ton of different techniques. And when I was going through this, trying to narrow them down is difficult. So all I'm doing is I'm trying to select the top 10 or so techniques that I know produced more than any other technique. So let me give you an example. Like I fished a Carolina rig last year only a couple of times. And I did catch some fish. In fact, I caught several really nice fish on a Carolina rig at the St. Lawrence River last year. But in the whole scheme of things, when I look at my 803 fish, the Carolina rig did not really catch me very many fish at all. I'm not even going to talk about it today. There's other techniques where I probably fish them about as much as, say, the Carolina rig, but they just happen to catch me more fish. So without further ado, let's dig right in. The first technique that I'm going to talk to you about today is this little bad boy right here. Dark Sleeper. I love the Dark Sleeper. It's one of my very favorite lures, and it could have been in my top 5, but I had to be honest and say, if I go back and look at which techniques caught me the most fish, it was those 5 that I showed you. This one, though, did catch me quite a bit of fish just because I threw it a lot. Now, the Dark Sleeper comes in a lot of different sizes now. They have like a 1/4 ounce, a 3/8 ounce, a 1/2 ounce, 3/4 ounce, 1 ounce, and I don't know, they might even have more sizes than that. I really only used, and still to this day, I still pretty much only throw 2 sizes, and that is the 1/2 ounce and the 3/4 ounce. These are my 2 go-tos. And it's usually the 1/2 ounce that I'm going to be throwing first and foremost. The only time I'm going to go up to a 3/4 is if I just am fishing in deeper water, need to get down deeper. I also will throw the 1 ounce every once in a while, same sort of thing. If I'm in super windy conditions, the current's really strong, or I need to get a lot deeper, that's when I'm going to throw the 1 ounce. Now, what about the 1/4 and the 3/8? There are not many scenarios where I would throw the 1/4, the 3/8. Now, if I lived way up north in smallmouth country, maybe so, but I don't. I live in the Midwest, and down here, the 1/2 and 3/4 are going to do me just fine. The only caveat to that would be if I am fishing a lot of really thick grass and I want to keep that bait up high in the water column above the grass, I probably would go down to that 3/8 or 1/4 ounce size, but that's an exception, a rare exception. In fact, I only had one time that I can remember last year where I was actually fishing with Dean out on Dead Dog Pond, and we were throwing, that pond is just loaded with grass. I mean, from front to back, middle, side to side, grass everywhere. There's almost no open water. And so you've got to find techniques that you can really keep really high in the water column above that grass. We were throwing the Dark Sleeper, doing that, and we were having a lot of success keeping it high, high, high. All right, as far as colors go, I will just show you. I don't have a lot of variety here. I have this color here. I don't know what they call it. I'll put it on the screen if I find what it's called. To me, this is kind of the best one that they have. that imitates a bluegill as far as color goes. So I do throw this one a lot. It's probably my number one choice because I fish in a lot of bluegill type areas. This one here is kind of a close second. In fact, you might argue that this is a better bluegill color. I don't know. But that's kind of my number two. And then my number three color is more of a natural shad looking pattern. That's this one here. I mean, there's not a lot of color to this at all. There's a chartreuse lateral line, and that's about it on this one. Now, how do I fish it? The way I generally start fishing a dark sleeper is I will cast it out, let it go to the bottom, and then slowly reel it in. And that seems to work really well, especially in colder water. As the water warms up, then I might get a little more active in trying to maybe twitch it or get it to do something other than just a steady retrieve. But the interesting thing about the dark sleeper is that it works really well just chunking it out there, winding it back. It really does work well there. Another way that you can fish this is you can flip it and pitch it in areas that you would flip and pitch any kind of a flipping bait. And sometimes that's going to get you, under low overhangs, in brush piles, in laydowns. You can flip it in there. It is pretty darn weedless with this hook being concealed here in the dorsal fin. Is that the dorsal fin? It's pretty darn weedless. You will hang it up if you're not careful, but it's amazing how weedless it is. It has incredible action. It works in ponds. It works in lakes. It works everywhere. As far as my setup goes, I pretty much will throw the dark sleeper on the identical tackle that I use for my chatterbaits. And in my chatterbait setup, I use a medium heavy to what I would call a light heavy. Not light meaning light. What I mean is on the heavy spectrum, you got some rods call it a 4 power, some rod makers call it a 5 power, some call it a 6 and a 7 power. When I say a light heavy, I'm talking between that 4.5 to 5 power range is about as heavy as I'm going to go throwing the dark sleeper. As far as line goes, I'm usually throwing around that 14, 15, 16 pound test line. If it's super ultra clear water, obviously I'm going to go with lighter line. If you want it to go deeper, faster, you want to throw it on lighter line. You can get down to that 12-pound test, especially if you're going with that 1/4 ounce or the 3/8 ounce. You can definitely go with lighter line. I always throw it on fluorocarbon. As far as my bait caster goes, anywhere in the 6 to 7 speed gear ratio. I'm really not going to throw it on an 8 or a 9, anything like that. The only time I might do that is if I were up close, actually flipping and pitching it into very close, short areas. Then I might go with a higher speed reel. But for the most part, I'm going to be really happy with that 6.4 to 1, 7.1 to 1, that kind of range is what I'm going to be using for my dark sleeper. Now, the one thing to keep in mind with the dark sleeper is that I believe that the fish, for the most part, it's a visual presentation. They get a look at it, they get a good look at it, they swim up behind it, and then they will suck it in from behind most of the time. And a lot of time that bite is going to be pretty subtle. It's not so subtle that you won't feel it. You usually will feel it. A lot of times it'll feel like it's coming through grass. And what you've really got is a fish has sucked it in. The way that you set the hook is you just keep reeling. You keep reeling a dark sleeper. When you start to feel it suck in, just keep reeling. And then you can kind of start to apply a little bit of steady pressure while you're continuing to reel. And they will suck it in very well. And the hook's sticky sharp. And it's going to hook, your hookup ratio is going to be fine on it. It's going to do well. What you don't want to do is when you start to feel that heaviness, you don't want to jerk it. Don't jerk your rod. Don't pop your rod. Just continue to reel. Do that. You're going to be fine. You're going to catch a lot of fish. The dark sleeper is a really, really great bait. It's fantastic. Highly recommend it. Go try it out. That is technique number 1. This next technique really some years has been my number 1 technique, or maybe my number 2 technique of all techniques. I'm not sure why I did not throw it as much as I usually do, because this is a bait that's always tied on. It's always in my boat. It's always on the ready. And I did fish this bait quite a bit, but if I'm being honest, I didn't catch nearly the amount of fish on this as I usually do from year to year. And I think it's because I was focusing on some of those techniques more that I showed you in video number 1. But square bill crankbait is critical. This lure right here, what can I say about it? There's tons of timber where I fish. There's tons of flooded trees. There's tons of brush piles, laydowns, rock piles, um, dirty water. And the square bill crankbait really shines in those conditions. So most of the time I've got one of these tied on and I'm throwing it. And I did throw this one a lot in the spring. This is one of my absolute favorite square bill crankbaits. It's by Lucky Craft. It is the Fat CB BDS2. They also make a BDS3. They make bigger sizes than that. This is the bait I'm throwing. I throw it a lot. I love this bait. Comes in a ton of great colors. Here's one of the colors I like to throw. Here's kind of like a sexy shad. That's a nice color I like to throw. This also is a very nice color. It's kind of beat up a little bit, but great bait. These are silent. I'm not always throwing a silent square bill. I also like the Strike King KVD 1.5s. I throw those a lot. I like the 6 cent square bill crankbaits quite a bit. I've got a ton of balsa square bills that I love. I really like these right here. These are the Wesley Strader crankbait. Excellent crankbait as well. Works just superb, fantastic. A square bill crankbait is just so versatile. It's really a great lure. Now, how do I fish it? I still like to throw my square bill crankbaits on glass. I have a lot of glass rods, and I just like fiberglass for square bill. I know a lot of people don't, but for me, I'm still a fiberglass fisherman. So I've got quite a few fiberglass rods from Dobbins Rods that I use. I've got some very nice St. Croix fiberglass rods that I throw. One of my favorite square bill rods is by Kistler. It's called the Feel and Reel, I think is what they call it. And it's a blended rod. Half of the rod is fiberglass. The other half is a carbon fiber modulus type material. And that's a very nice blend. It gives you a lot of feel, a lot of sensitivity, but it also gives you the desired effect that you get from glass. And by desired effect from glass, I'm talking about the fact that with a glass rod, it's just a little more forgiving when it comes to those treble hooks. The problem with glass is it's not very sensitive. You can't feel nearly as much with fiberglass as you can with a graphite carbon fiber type rod. I don't really care about that though, especially for square bill fishing. All I really need to feel is that it's hitting against stuff. And when as long as it's in the junk hitting against stuff, without a doubt when you've got a bite. There's no surprise. There's no trying to figure it out. And those are the kind of rods that I prefer. Usually I'm going with a 7-foot or longer rod when I'm throwing crankbaits, but usually in that 7 to 7'4" range. Now, square bill fishing, I throw a little slower reel. I do have some 5-speed reels that I will throw square bills on. But normally I'm still throwing in that 6-4 to 1 range. But I do throw some on some 5s as well. And then my go-to line size is around 12-pound fluorocarbon. I don't like throwing braid. I do have some combos set up with braid, 30-pound braid, 40-pound braid. I just don't like it. I don't like throwing braid on my bait casters at all. So I always end up going back to fluorocarbon or monofilament. And I still will throw monofilament quite a bit with square bills for several reasons. One, it floats. Two, it has a little more stretch, which I think is also good for the treble hooks. The other is it's cheap. And when you're throwing a square bill, you're going to tear up a bunch of line. It's going to get beat up and cut up and nicked up, and you're going to have to retie a lot. You're going to go through quite a bit of line. Monofilament by far is definitely the cheapest. And there's some really high quality monofilament lines out there. Maxima is one of my favorite. This new Strike King clear monofilament seems like it's really good stuff. There's a lot of, what I'm saying is the technology in monofilament has gone way up over the years compared to how it used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago. And don't be afraid to throw your square bills on monofilament. So that kind of is my technique number 2, the square bill crankbait. I love the square bill. Why don't you put down in the comments, if you would, what your favorite square bill is to throw? I'd love to hear what it is. My third technique in this video, it may not surprise you, but it definitely surprises me. And the reason is because I bet you in 2020, I did not throw this bait at all. If I did, I threw it very little. And I can guarantee you in 2019, I did not throw this bait at all. It's just never been a bait that I've really been a huge fan of. But this year has kind of changed my mind. And I've thrown it a lot this year. And it's caught me a lot of fish. And I definitely see the value of the swim jig. Yeah, that's right. The swim jig has kind of freaking rocked my world this year. I started throwing it really early in the spring. And I think the first swim jig I was throwing was one that Burley Fishing sent me when we did a tackle exchange. And I'm trying to remember what brand of swim jig that was. It was an excellent swim jig, though. I loved it, and basically fished with it like crazy. And then I started expanding. The Booyah Mobster swim jig came out late in the year. I bought a bunch of these and have started throwing these. I really like these. I've got so many different swim jigs now, and I'm throwing them. Same thing. Whenever I'm throwing a chatterbait, I've got a swim jig tied on in case they want something a little more subtle. Also, if I'm fishing in grass, I'm going to be throwing that chatterbait, but I'm also going to be fishing a swim jig. And since then, I've kind of really tried, bought a bunch. I've thrown a bunch here and there. I can't tell you off the top of my head which ones these are. Unfortunately, some of them I can tell you, but a lot of them I can't. I can't remember who makes them. This here, of course, is a 6 Sense Divine swim jig. They're nice. Let's see here. Here's one from Dirty Jigs. Dirty Jigs makes great jigs, and their swim jigs are nice as well. Really nice, high quality components. Their skirts are great. This one here, I believe, is the Bill Lowen signature swim jig that you can buy from, what's it called, Lure Parts online. Bill Lowen is his claim to fame is really swim jigs. So I bought some of his specific ones. Here's kind of a big old crazy honking swim jig from Jewel Baits. Kind of a big, huge arrow-shaped head. Swim jig fishing is a lot of fun. It really is. And then here's kind of this mouse head of the Mobster swim jig, in case you want to see what that mouse-like looking head is. This one, Chris Jones fished at the Classic. Really nice bait. So swim jig fishing has caught me a lot of fish this year. For the most part, the trailer that I put on my swim jigs is a Rage Menace. Seems like 9 times out of 10, that's what I'm putting on it, and it's fine. It works great. Any kind of a crawdad type trailer or chunk can be used on a swim jig and works great. So, the sky is the limit really as far as trailers go. But for me, I'm going to start out with that Rage Menace, and if it's catching fish, I'm not going to change up. If the Rage Menace does, it is a little more subtle than some other trailers. So if that real subtle bite or the real subtle action from the Rage Menace is not really catching me fish, then I will probably put something a little more erratic on there and try it, see if that works. Swim jig fishing. Now, there's different schools of thought on what kind of a rod you should be throwing your swim jig on. Bill Lowen throws his swim jigs on a heavy rod. I throw a lot of swim jigs on a heavy rod, but I kind of go back to that medium heavy that I'm throwing my chatterbait on, and I'll throw that as well. The thing about a swim jig is you do need enough backbone that when they suck that bait in, you can really set the hook well. Also, a lot of times with a swim jig, you've got to impart a lot of action on that rod, and you need to have a rod that makes it easy for you to kind of do this the whole time you're retrieving your bait. As long as you've got that, you should be fine. I will go up with a little faster speed reel on this. Usually I'll start in the 7 to 1. I might even put it on an 8 to 1, depending upon what the fish are doing, because a lot of times I'm burning that swim jig or I'm moving it a lot faster than I might another bait. So that's a swim jig. It's a go-to technique. I highly recommend that as well. It caught me a ton of fish this year. Really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to use it next year also. Okay, the next technique, it was my surprise technique of 2021. The Mike Buka Baby Bull Gill. This little glide bait crushed them. I just caught a ton of fish on this thing this year. I absolutely love it. It's one of my new favorite baits. I just started throwing it this year. I'm in love with it. It's great. The other great news is they're coming out with new shad type colors. This is the crappie color, and this is the closest one I believe that they have that looks kind of shaddy. It really looks like a crappie, but it's white. So you could pull this off as a shad type lure. Most of them right now are in gill colors, and they're great. Their gill patterns are freaking awesome, but they definitely need some shad color, some shad patterns, and that's what's coming around the corner. So I'm excited about that. Even though I have a ton of swim baits behind me, I have a ton of glide baits. I really love that kind of fishing. I did not throw a glide bait hardly at all, maybe 2 or 3 times. And that's because when you're chasing 1,000 fish, a big, huge glide bait like the Depths 250 slide swimmer makes no sense. You might catch a giant, but it doesn't really help me get my 1,000 fish. And literally every time I was on the water, I was worried about those 1,000 fish, and I was thinking quantity, quantity, quantity. So the techniques that I threw were pretty much focusing on that. And I will say that the Baby Bull Gill is a numbers bait. It's going to catch you a lot of fish. Very small fish will hit this. Very large fish will hit it, and any fish in between. It's a great bait. I love it. I can't say enough about it. I throw that on a crankbait rod, just like I would throw any other treble hook lure. Um, Anywhere from a medium to a medium heavy rod, and it's usually going to be 7 foot long or longer, and it's going to need to have a fast tip. You do need enough backbone that you can set the hook on that thing. So that's the one difference. Rather than just a massively moderate tapered rod, I probably would go with a fast tapered rod. You could use a moderate rod, but for the most part, I'm going to go with a fast tip on that rod. And then I throw it on fluorocarbon. Same thing, 14 to 20 pound test fluorocarbon, depending upon water conditions, clarity, that kind of thing. That's what I'm going to throw it on. And this is a technique. You can just chunk it out there, reel it in. Now you can play with the rod tip and you can play with the reel if you want to give it some different action, or you want to try to get it to turn 180 degrees on itself, that kind of stuff. But you don't need to be a rocket scientist to fish the bullgill. All you got to do is tie it on, throw it out there, reel it in. It's probably going to catch you fish. As far as the speed of the reel goes, like I said, it's 6-4 to 1, 7-1 to 1, 8-1 to 1. When you get into that super high speed, the problem I think with a super high speed reel is you're going to have to consciously tell yourself to slow it down. So I probably wouldn't throw it on a super high speed reel, but any of those typical speed reels that you would throw a spinnerbait on or a chatterbait on, that's the kind of reel I would use. The next technique that caught me a lot of fish in 2021, and truth be told, caught me a lot of fish in 2020 and 2019 and 2018 and 2017, is one of my absolute favorite techniques, the Senko. That's right. I love fishing a Senko, which is a 5-inch stick worm. That's what a Senko is. There's nothing fancy about it. It comes in a ton of different colors. You can also get this in, this is the 5-inch size. The 5-inch is kind of the most common size, and it's definitely the size that I fish the most. It's a nice white chatty one. Here's kind of a one with a lot of silver flake in it. Black and bluish. What brands do I go with? I go with the Yamamoto Senko almost all the time. That's what I started with. I've never seen a Senko replacement out there that's any better. I absolutely love the Yamamoto Senko. Here it is. 9 times out of 10, this is the brand that I use and throw. They have plenty of colors. They absolutely catch fish. Some people complain that they're not durable enough. I think they're plenty durable enough, especially if you use an O-ring. You can definitely catch multiple fish with a single Senko. I also like to throw the 6-inch and the 7-inch size. Here's a couple of cool special colors that I bought that I'll show you. This one is called Special Peanut Butter and Jelly. Look at that thing. This is a freaking awesome color. I wish I had more of this specific color. It's a thing of beauty. Anyway, that's the 6-inch size. I will also throw the 7-inch size sometimes. Like in early spring, I might throw the 7-inch size. Here's a laminate special black and blue as well. I like the laminates. Black on that side, blue on this side. If I turn it, you can see pretty prominent separation between the black and the blue. And here's kind of a sprayed grass color. What do they call this one? They call it special sprayed grass, actually. And I'm almost out of these. This is another great natural, man. I love this color too. I think a lot of people don't realize that Yamamoto will make you custom colors. They have a pretty large limit that you have to buy, but they will make you custom colors. At least I think they still will. Other brands that I really like, I like the Sticko worm from Bass Pro Shops. This particular color is one I throw a lot. It's called Green Pumpkin Blue. My buddy Joe got me onto this color. The Bass Pro stick baits hold up really well. They're durable. And in this part of the world, we like throwing green pumpkin with some blue flake in it. And this is a really nice one from Bass Pro Shops. The Ocho I like a lot by Strike King. The Yum Dinger, no problems. It's a great bait. Pretty much any company that makes a Senko style bait, you're probably going to be fine with. Here's an Ocho. This is a 7-inch Ocho. The thing that makes the Ocho different, which is why I kind of always throw the Ocho or have it in my box, is it's got these flat sides on it, which I think gives it just a little different action and look in the water. And so sometimes, especially if I'm like in a tournament situation and I hear that a lot of people are throwing Senkos, I might throw the Ocho instead of the regular Senko just to give them, the fish, a little something different to look at. Absolutely love Senko fishing. Now, there are a number of ways to fish a Senko. The wacky rig, of course, is probably the most common, and I do fish the wacky rig quite a bit. The problem with wacky rig is it takes a lot of patience. It takes quite a while for that bait to get to the target. And so I probably fish at Texas rig more than I do wacky rig, quite frankly. The other thing I've learned over the years is that I do not do nearly as well with a small hook when I wacky rig. So I have kind of gone to the bigger hooks for wacky rigging. Let me show you a couple that I like to throw. This is, man, I don't know who makes this. I think this might be a Gamakatsu style hook. This is actually a light wire flipping hook. And but I will wacky rig this and I will Texas rig it as well. Another one that my buddy Joe throws a lot, and I actually do as well too, if I want to give it a little more weight. But this is not a hook manufacturer that you probably have heard of every day, but it has a weight up here. So you can actually Texas rig and fish your Senko weightless with these hooks because it has a weight on it. The problem with these weights is when you try to Texas rig, these weights will tear your baits bad. So you almost need to go up with the bigger size, a 6 or 7-inch size, when you're using these kind of hooks. An EWG style hook is a fine hook to use as well. Some people don't like it. Some people swear by it. And then, of course, you have your typical wacky hooks that are more of an octopus style hook or a round circle hook. I do throw those quite a bit, but I really am starting to change. I'm starting to go to those bigger hooks. I just feel like the hookup ratio is way, way better. It obviously depends upon the cover, where you're fishing, that kind of thing, as to whether or not you can fish a big open hook or you need one of those that have a weed guard on it and that kind of thing. But without a doubt, Senko is a beautiful thing. This could have been in my top 5, really, but I'm very confident that the ribbon tail worm that I showed in the previous video caught me more fish than the Senko did this last year. Go check out the Senko. You will not regret it. Okay, now we're getting into a few more baits that were kind of productive for me in spurts. So it's not like I was fishing with this technique all year long, but there were times when I fished with it and it was very effective. And that is the Tokyo rig. And the Tokyo rig's gotten way more versatile. When it first came out, there was only like one type of hook that you could get. Now you can get all kinds of different types of hooks. These are EWG style hooks, and you can get them all in different sizes. This is your worm hook, same way. So Tokyo rig, maybe you know a lot about a Tokyo rig. Maybe you don't know anything about a Tokyo rig. So I will show you kind of the process here. I've got several Tokyo rig hooks. The Tokyo rig for me is one of the reasons I like to throw it is I feel like it's super effective, yet a lot of people still don't throw it. It kind of was a flash in the pan. Not to say that there aren't people throwing it. There are. Basically, what you've got is you've got a hook, and it's attached to this wire. And it's kind of like a mini drop shot in some ways. You know, a drop shot, you've got your leader that goes down, and then you've got your drop shot weight below. This just has a wire, and you put your weight on the wire. What kind of weight can you put? You can use a bullet weight if you want. You can put it on either direction. Normally I put it on this direction with the pointy part down. But you can do two. I've done two several times when I needed more weight. I've just put two bullet weights on like this, and then you just bend the wire. When you bend the wire, it's going to stay on. You can also use your typical kind of these weights here are cylindrical weights. They're big and beefy. They're made for Carolina rigs, but you can definitely put a Carolina rig weight on here if you want. If you got to go pretty heavy, I mean, that's a 3/4 ounce, so that's really heavy. But they've also now started manufacturing these cylinder weights that have a hole going all the way through them, like so, made specifically for the Tokyo rig. And so that's what I've kind of gone to, is this cylinder weight on your Tokyo rig. You bend that over, you rig this up, you throw it out. This weight's going to hang freely down on the bottom, and your bait is going to be up off of the bottom, and you can go to town. What's my go-to bait for a Tokyo rig? Pretty much any kind of a crawdad bait. So like this camel craw from Thunder Hawk Lures, great bait to put on a Tokyo rig. You can put any soft plastic bait you want on a Tokyo rig, but for me this year I was throwing mostly crawdad style baits and beaver style baits. But the Strike King Rage Craw, fished with it quite a bit. The 6-cent Stroker Craw, I was fishing a lot on a Tokyo rig. My go-to bait for a Tokyo rig is a crawdad type lure. If that's not working, then I will go to a lizard. I'll go to a creature bait. I'll go to something like that. But I usually start with a crawdad type bait. I fish this on a jig and worm rod. Usually 7'1" is the shortest. I will fish it all the way up to an 8-foot long rod. And usually it's going to be a heavy, medium heavy, meaning 4 power or heavier is usually what I'm going to throw this rod on. And I usually fish it with a fast reel, 8-to-1 or 9-to-1 speed reel. I'll fish it on heavy braid with a fluorocarbon leader, or I'll throw it on 20-pound fluorocarbon. Either of those, I don't care. Either works fine. And the reason I do that is I'm really kind of flipping and pitching this in the same sort of spots that I would flip a Texas rigged style bait in. That's normally the way I'm going to fish it most of the time. One of the areas where it was really effective for me this year was right along the edge of grass lines. So you may want to try that. It does work. Trying to throw it right into thick, heavy grass is not easy. But if you've got grass patches that have open spots, they work great in there. It's also a great bait to use on bedding fish. There's a lot of different ways to fish a Tokyo rig, and it was a very effective lure for me this year. So go give that a try. I think you'll enjoy it. I think you will. Once you start catching fish with it, when they're on this bite, they're on, man, and it's really fun. The interesting thing here, as I was thinking about this, is uh, you will notice some of the baits that I have not mentioned this year. One of them was the Carolina rig. The other is just a jig, a flipping type jig. I threw a jig quite a bit. In fact, I am a jig fisherman. I love to fish jigs. My buddy Joe that I mentioned earlier, he's a real jig fisherman. And for some reason, neither of us had a lot of luck with jigs this year. We just didn't get many bites fishing a jig. But I did get quite a few bites fishing this Tokyo rig. And I think a Tokyo rig is a nice alternative to fishing a jig if for some reason you can't get the jig to bite. The funny thing is, I had a lot of luck on the swim jig. I had a lot of luck on the vibrating jig. But the football jig and the flipping jig, not enough to mention in these two videos. So you're not going to see jigs in these videos other than the vibrating jig and the swim jig. That's strange. That's very odd for me, which just kind of shows you that's odd. Now, part of that might have to do with the fact that if a flipping bite is on, a lot of times I'm going to go with a flipping bait, like a creature style bait, Texas rigged with a bullet weight instead of a jig. When I'm trying to catch big fish, like for tournaments, that's when I like to throw that jig. You're going to get a lot less bites on a jig, but they're going to be bigger bites. So that probably is one of the reasons I didn't throw a jig as much this year either, because I was going for 1,000 fish. I knew a jig bite's going to get me big fish. It may not get me a lot of bites though, where something like the chatterbait's going to get me a lot of bites. Okay, we're winding down. We're getting down to the last of the techniques. Let me mention just a couple of others that I could have put on the list that I decided not to. One was the wobble head or the biffle head. I think I've got one sitting here. I actually had a couple of spurts last year, 2021, where the biffle head caught me some great fish. But again, the quantities were not enough to say that this was one of my top lures for 2021, but it's still a great bait. It's one of my favorites. And I have decided I'm going to throw the wobblehead a lot more in 2022. A couple of others that may have been on your list that were not on my list just have to do with the fact that, like, say, for example, topwaters. I threw and fished a popper quite a bit this year. Got some bites. In fact, I had a few days where I was fishing a popper for white bass and had, easily a 50 fish day. But when I'm talking about largemouth bass fishing, I didn't have a ton of luck on the popper or on the spook this year. It was usually that buzzbait, the buzzbait was my top water lure for the year. Same with the whopper plopper. Did I catch fish on a spook this year? Absolutely. Did I catch fish on a popper? Yes. Did I catch fish on a whopper plopper? Yes. But usually when I was throwing a topwater, most of my fish were coming on a buzzbait this year. So I decided not to include any of those other topwater lures. Jerkbait. I didn't put a jerkbait in my techniques this year. Just quite frankly, the conditions just never worked out where I was really throwing a jerkbait much in 2021. So it's just the way it goes sometimes. Some years I'm throwing that jerkbait like crazy. Some years I'm not. A jerkbait is definitely a numbers bait, though. If the conditions had been right, I absolutely would have been throwing it because it would have helped me in my numbers count for sure. Unlike, say, the jig where you might get quality but not necessarily quantity. All right, with this next technique, I don't want to sound redundant, but I'm going with another worm. One thing should be absolutely clear to you after watching part 1 and part 2 of this video series. Mr. Bass throws a lot of worms. And the reason I do is they work. Worm fishing flat out catches fish. And there's no way I could leave out the trick worm. This is a freaking awesome, awesome, awesome bait. I every year catch so many fish from pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn, pretty much every time of year except the cold, cold part of the winter. I'm throwing a trick worm, either on a shaky head or on a Texas rig. In fact, I also will fish this weightless in the springtime. I'll also fish on a Carolina rig. But my number one technique of fishing a trick worm is got to be Texas rigging it. There's just so many ways to fish it effectively, but Texas rigging is my number one go-to. I throw this color bubble gum in the springtime on beds. I freaking love the trick worm, and this Zoom trick worm is superb. Really, 90% of the time I'm throwing the Zoom trick worm. This is my go-to worm. This color's great. This is June bug. I showed you the bubble gum. I got 30 colors of these. I mean, every color under the sun they make, and it works great. Red bug here is another great trick worm color. You may say, well, when do you throw this what color? Well, it really doesn't matter most of the time. The fish will bite just about any color, but sometimes you'll get on a lake where red bug really is hot here, you know. The big thing to keep in mind with worm colors is if you're in dark water, you need a dark color. Stained, dirty water, you need a black or a black and blue. I like just straight black is great. I like black and blue. When you get to that clear water, that's when I start going to the reds and the plums and that sort of thing. June bug works really good in dark water as well. Here's a go-to color for me. Green pumpkin with a little bit of blue in it. I mentioned that to you earlier. Another brand that I was thinking about the trick worms that I threw this year. Hands down, Zoom trick worm is my number one worm. Guess what number two was, though? The 6 Cents Divine Shaky Worm, which is just 6 cents trick worm is all it is. It's a little fatter, as you can see here, and it's got kind of a little fat bulbousy tail. To tell you the truth, the Divine Shaky Worm probably fits on a shaky head a little better, but not much better. One area where I think the Divine Shaky Worm probably outfishes the trick worm is on a Nico rig, just because the head's so much fatter. Getting that nail weight into the head of the Divine Shaky Worm is going to be a lot easier than a Zoom trick worm. But I throw the Magnum trick worms as well. They're fatter and they work great. Trick worm fishing is, you got to have a trick worm in your box. You've got to. It is so darn effective. It's just fantastic in so many scenarios. So don't forget the trick worm. You're going to love it. It's just a great technique. Now, what about equipment, rod, reel, line, that sort of thing? I fish this most of the time on a bait caster on my jig and worm rods. Most of my jig and worm rods are G Loomis rods. They're in that 7 foot, 7'1", 7'2", 7'3" length. They're mostly medium heavy and fast action, fast tip. Sometimes if I'm fishing a trick worm in real heavy cover where I really need to set the hook hard and get them out of the cover like really quick, then I go with an extra fast tip. But most of the time, just a fast tip. And I'll go with heavier line. 15 to 20 pound line is what I'm throwing a trick worm on usually. Now, if I put it on shaky head, I might go down a little lighter than that. But, you know, unless the water's just super slick clear, you know, like crystal clear, Mead Lake clear, I'm still going with a pretty heavy line because even though trick worm fishing sounds like a finesse technique, it's a power fishing technique. It's not a drop shot. A drop shot is a very finessey technique, but a trick worm is a power technique. Now you can throw a trick worm on a spinning rod sometimes in the fall, especially if I'm fishing the floating worm, which means I'm fishing the trick worm weightless. A lot of times I will fish that on a spinning setup, but vast majority of time I've got my bait caster tied on. Anyway, you can do either or. There's no hard and fast rule on that. Whatever your choice is will work. Notice I mentioned drop shot, but I didn't mention drop shot. Drop shot did catch me fish this year, but about the only time I threw it was when I was up on the St. Lawrence River. I fished the flatworms on it mostly, and that was 3 or 4 days of fishing total. So that's about all I threw a drop shot. So that's why I didn't include drop shot in my list. Even though that week that I was up at the St. Lawrence River, I caught quite a few fish on the drop shot, it still is not what I would call one of my top techniques for 2021. Who knows what 2022 will bring? All right, that's it. That is a wrap. I am done. Those are my top lures for 2021 that helped me catch 803 fish for the year. It was a blast. I had a great time. I hope you enjoyed these videos. Hopefully, I helped you learn a few things. I probably surprised you because I'm sure there's some techniques you're like, I can't believe you didn't throw that this year. But that's just the way it works sometimes. One of the things that's absolutely clear from this video, these two videos, and that is there are a lot of different techniques that will catch fish. You don't need all these techniques. Just pick a few, especially if you're new to fishing. Just pick a few, work on those. Make sure if you're brand new to fishing that one of those techniques is a worm, some type of a worm. Get good at that. Get good at throwing a chatterbait, and then you can start expanding from there. I hope this was helpful and informative. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, another thing. If you want to purchase any of these items, I should have links in the description below that you can just click on and go and buy a lot of the items we talked about today. If you do, that helps the channel some. No obligation, obviously. Thanks for supporting the channel. Please smash the like button. Please subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell to find out when I'm doing my next live stream. We always give away a ton of fun stuff on the live streams, and we have a great time. Thanks again for supporting the channel, and until next time, this is Mr. Bass. Happy fishing!